Welcome to the Sober and Happy podcast, where we talk about all things recovery related, how to navigate the challenges that we'll face along the way on our journey towards our best lives, and how we could go from living a life of simply just being sober to a life where we're both sober and happy. Today we're tackling a big topic, triggers. If you've been in recovery for even a short time, you've likely heard the word triggers thrown around a lot. Maybe you've been told to avoid them entirely. But what happens when avoidance just isn't realistic? What happens when you're confronted with a trigger that you didn't see coming? The truth is that we live in a society where alcohol is everywhere. Commercials on TV, billboards on the highways, casual mentions and conversations. It's unavoidable. So instead of exhausting ourselves trying to avoid triggers, what if we learned how to face them, understand them, and deflate their power? In this episode, we'll explore practical steps to navigate triggers, challenge the myth that avoidance is the only solution, and learn how to live in a world where triggers exist without letting them control us. So buckle up. This is going to be a great episode. Welcome back. Triggers are one of the most misunderstood aspects of recovery. For many of us, they can feel like sudden ambushes. One minute, you're fine, and the next, a smell, a memory, or even a specific time of the day brings an overwhelming urge to drink or use. I want to start by acknowledging that triggers are normal. They're not a sign that you're failing in recovery. They're a sign that you are human. The goal isn't to live a life where triggers don't exist. That's impossible. The goal is to live a life where triggers lose their power over us. Early in my recovery, I was taught that anything that might trigger us was to be avoided. I did a relapse prevention plan before leaving rehab, and there was a section where they had me list everything that might trigger me, and then I was to list ways I could avoid each of those triggers. Then when I got home and started going to meetings, much of the message I heard was the same. I was told to avoid people, places, and things where alcohol might be present because I was not strong enough to resist it. I knew nothing about being sober, and I was petrified of relapsing, so I listened. I declined party invitations, drove alternative routes on my way home to avoid driving by my regular liquor store, shopped at a grocery store that didn't have soda and beer on the same aisle, and stayed far away from bars. While this helped initially, I quickly realized that avoidance has limits. Here's the problem. Alcohol and reminders of drinking are woven into the fabric of our culture. Unless you live in a bubble, you're going to encounter them. And the more you avoid something, the bigger and scarier it gets. It's like trying to outrun your shadow. It's always there. And here's the other thing. Having to avoid things I wanted to do because I was avoiding triggers was a trigger in itself. I realized this after declining an invitation to see a concert because I was worried about being triggered by walking past the beer stands. That night, while my friends were enjoying the concert, I was instead sitting at home on my couch all night thinking about how I couldn't even go to a concert because of my fear of alcohol. So although I avoided walking by those beer stands at the concert, I still thought about them all night. And to top that off, instead of enjoying myself at a concert, I sat home angry, frustrated, and depressed, all triggering emotions. In this scenario, I was actually doing more harm by avoiding the initial trigger. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying you should intentionally put yourself in triggering situations to prove a point you could do it, especially in early sobriety. There's no need to test your limits unnecessarily, but we can't spend our lives running either. Instead of avoiding triggers, we must understand them and create strategies to navigate them. So, what is a trigger? A trigger is anything that brings back memories, feelings, or cravings tied to drinking or using. They could be external, like walking into a bar or hearing a specific song, or they could be internal, like feeling stressed, lonely, or bored. Here's an analogy. Triggers are like alarm bells. They're not the danger itself, they're just the signal. When an alarm goes off, you don't have to panic. You investigate. You figure out what set it off and decide how to respond. Now that we have a better idea of what a trigger is, let's talk about how we could start removing their power over us. Let's start with understanding your triggers. Awareness is a foundation here because you can't manage something if you don't know what it is. Start paying attention to moments when cravings pop up. Is it a certain place, a specific person, or maybe an emotion like stress or boredom? For me, early in sobriety, I found that boredom was a massive trigger. Those idle moments felt unbearable, and my mind would start to wander back to the fact that I often used alcohol to treat boredom. The best way I found to become aware of your triggers is by keeping a journal, which you could easily do using the Notes app on your phone. Every time you feel a craving, jot down what's happening. Where are you? What are you feeling? What just happened? Over time, you'll start to notice patterns. Maybe it's always around a particular time of the day, or maybe it's certain interactions that set you off. This awareness isn't just helpful, it's empowering because once you see the patterns, you could start to break them. Now, let's shift our perspective. When I first got sober, I saw triggers as my enemy, like little landmines scattered throughout my day waiting to explode. But here's a thought. What if triggers aren't enemies? What if they're your teachers? Hear me out here. Triggers shine a light on the areas of our lives that need attention. For example, if you're triggered by stress at work, that's not just an annoyance, that's valuable information. It might mean that you need better boundaries with coworkers. It might mean that it's finally time to chase your dream job, or even that it's just time to learn healthier ways to handle stress. Once you understand your triggers, it's time to create a plan. Think about it like preparing for a hike. If you know it's going to be hot, you bring water. If you know there might be bugs, you bring repellent. Planning for triggers works the same way. Let's say boredom is a big one for you. Instead of waiting until you're bored to figure out what to do, have a list ready. Go for a walk, try a new hobby, or call a friend. For social situations, planning is a game changer. Think about how you'll respond if someone offers you a drink. Practice saying, "No thanks, I'm good." Or even having a non-alcoholic drink in your hand to avoid the conversation altogether. It's not about creating a perfect response. It's about taking the guesswork out of the moment so that you could stay grounded. Now, here's a truth that could be uncomfortable. The only way to truly reduce the power of triggers is to face them. It's like building a muscle. You don't get stronger by avoiding the gym. You get stronger by lifting weights. That doesn't mean throwing yourself into the deep end. For example, one guy I met early in recovery kept a half-full bottle of Jack Daniels on his nightstand to prove to himself he was strong enough to resist it every morning. Unfortunately, he proved himself wrong shortly after he started the experiment. That is not the type of exposure I'm talking about here. But it does mean gradually exposing yourself to triggering situations safely and intentionally. For example, if you're nervous about attending a party, start with something smaller, maybe a lunch with one or two people you trust. Or if you're triggered by a certain place, like going to a concert with friends, make sure your first concerts are with supportive friends and always have a foolproof exit plan if things get too tough. These small, controlled exposures could help you build confidence and resilience over time. One of the most important lessons I've learned is about acceptance. Early in recovery, I fought triggers like they were a battle to win. If a beer commercial came on, I would think, why do they even allow those on TV? If someone brought up alcohol, I'd feel personally attacked. But here's the thing, resisting triggers often give them more power. Acceptance, on the other hand, deflates them. There's a quote by Eckhart Tolle that I love. He says, "Accept, then act. Whatever the present moment contains, accept it as if you had chosen it. Always work with that, not against it. Make it your friend and ally, not your enemy. This will miraculously transform your whole life." I love that quote because although we can't control the things that happen around us, how we respond to them is 100% in our control. It goes back to what we had said earlier about using triggers as teachers rather than an enemy. So when a trigger comes up, instead of fighting it, pause and acknowledge it. Say, okay, this is a trigger. It's uncomfortable, but it's not dangerous. I can handle this. That shift in mindset takes you from being reactive to being in control. And lastly, lean on your support system. Triggers feel a lot heavier when we try to face them alone. This could mean calling a friend, hanging out with people in our recovery community, or even posting it to an online recovery support group. Sometimes just saying, hey, I'm feeling triggered, could start to take the edge off. I've learned that most people are willing to help if you let them. Early in recovery, I felt embarrassed to reach out. I thought I needed to handle everything on my own. But the truth is, the people who care about you want to support you. And sometimes just hearing someone say, I get it, and you're doing great, can make all the difference. Triggers are a normal part of recovery, but they do not have to derail you. By understanding them, creating strategies, and building resilience, you could navigate them with confidence. Remember, the goal isn't to avoid triggers forever. It's to live in a way where triggers no longer control you. As we wrap up, I want to challenge you. This week, take some time to reflect on your triggers. Write them down, get curious about them, and think about how you can navigate them differently this time. Thank you for listening to this episode, and I hope you're enjoying the podcast. If you are, please do me a favor and grab your phone and text one person who you think might benefit from listening to the podcast. That would mean the world to me. New episodes come out each Friday, so I look forward to connecting with you next week. And as always, thank you so much for listening. Keep living sober and happy.